I remember the day I handed my parents the check as vividly as if it were yesterday. My hands trembled slightly as I slid the envelope across the table. It wasn't every day you gave away $200,000, but for my parents, it felt like a small way to repay the immeasurable sacrifices they'd made for me. "Are you sure about this, son?" my father asked, his voice thick with emotion. My mother dabbed at the corner of her eyes with a tissue. "Absolutely," I replied, smiling. "You've done so much for me, and now it's my turn. Use it however you want, fix up the house, take a vacation, or just enjoy retirement. It's yours." For months, I heard little snippets of how they were enjoying their newfound financial freedom. My mom called to say they'd redone the kitchen. My dad mentioned something about paying off the mortgage. It all seemed above board, but a gnawing curiosity began to build in the back of my mind. I didn't doubt their intentions, but $200,000 was a lot of money. So one day, without warning, I decided to pay them a surprise visit. What I found would change everything. It was a crisp autumn morning when I decided to make the drive to their house. I hadn't visited in a while, but they never seemed to mind. They were always happy to see me, no matter how unannounced my arrival might be. As I turned into the familiar cul-de-sac, I couldn't help but notice how pristine the house looked. The front lawn, once a bit overgrown, was now manicured to perfection. The front porch gleamed as if freshly painted, and the windows sparkled in the morning sun. It seemed like they'd been busy putting my gift to good use. I parked my car and approached the front door, a bouquet of flowers in hand. I knocked, half expecting my mom to swing open the door with her usual smile. Instead, the door creaked open slightly, and I was greeted by silence. "Mom? Dad?" I called, stepping inside. The interior of the house looked different too. The old, scuffed hardwood floors had been replaced with sleek tiles, and the living room was furnished with brand new leather sofas. I could see the evidence of where the money had gone, and it brought a smile to my face. But something still felt off. As I moved through the house, I heard faint laughter coming from the backyard. Curious, I followed the sound to find my parents sitting on the new patio furniture, chatting with a couple I didn't recognize. A table laden with snacks and drinks sat between them, and they were all laughing like old friends. I hesitated, not wanting to interrupt, but my dad spotted me. "Hey, look who's here," he exclaimed, waving me over. My mom's eyes lit up as she stood to embrace me. "What a nice surprise," she said, pulling me into a hug. "We were just catching up with some new friends. Come, meet Tom and Diane." I greeted the couple politely, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I had walked into something I wasn't meant to see. There was a certain air between them, an unspoken connection that I couldn't quite place. I took a seat on the patio, my eyes scanning the scene as I tried to piece together the dynamics of this group. Tom and Diane were friendly enough, but there was something about their familiarity with my parents that struck me as odd. "We've been meaning to introduce you to these two," my mom said, pouring me a glass of lemonade. "Tom and Diane live just a few streets over. We met them at the neighborhood association meeting." "Lovely couple," my dad added, clinking his glass with Tom's. "They've got some great ideas about community projects." As I sat there, listening to their chatter about local events and renovations, I noticed Tom casually mention a joint venture they were working on with my parents. Something about a shared investment in reclaiming old spaces. It piqued my interest. "Reclaiming old spaces?" I asked, leaning forward. "What kind of project is that?" Tom gave a practiced laugh and waved a hand. "Oh, just a little something we're putting together, a community venture. Your parents have been such enthusiastic supporters." I glanced at my dad, who gave me a tight-lipped smile. "It's nothing big," he said, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his tone. "Just a chance to make a difference." The words hung in the air, and I couldn't help but feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere. My parents had never been ones to involve themselves in community ventures or joint investments. This was new, and unexpected. "So, where's this project happening?" I asked, keeping my tone light. My mom quickly changed the subject, launching into a story about how she and Diane had redecorated the upstairs guest room. It was a clear diversion, but I didn't press further. Not yet. As the afternoon wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. My parents had never been great at keeping secrets, but whatever they were involved in, they were being unusually careful about what they revealed. After Tom and Diane left, my parents insisted I stay for dinner. I agreed, figuring it would give me more time to untangle the threads of the mystery. While my mom busied herself in the kitchen, I joined my dad in the den. He was adjusting the dials on his record player, and a soft crackle of jazz filled the room. "Dad," I said, easing into the armchair across from him, "this investment you're working on with Tom and Diane, it sounds different for you." He didn't look up from the record player. "Different how?" he asked, his tone guarded. "You've never been much of an investor," I replied carefully. "I mean, I'm glad you're branching out, but it just seems sudden." He chuckled, though it felt forced. "Well, your mom and I decided it was time to step out of our comfort zone. Do something meaningful with the money you gave us." I nodded, though the answer didn't satisfy me. Before I could probe further, my mom called us to the dining table. The meal was delicious: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, and we fell into familiar rhythms of conversation. They asked about my work, my friends, my plans for the holidays. For a while, it felt like old times. But I couldn't shake the undercurrent of unease. After dinner, while my mom washed dishes and my dad watched the evening news, I wandered upstairs. I told myself it was innocent curiosity, but deep down, I knew I was snooping. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a hint, a clue about what my parents were really up to. Their bedroom door was slightly ajar, and inside, I noticed a stack of papers on the nightstand. I hesitated, then stepped closer. On top of the pile was a brochure titled Silver Pines Retreat, a premier lifestyle experience. The name struck me as strange. I flipped through the glossy pages, which were filled with photos of a sprawling compound nestled in the woods. There were images of luxurious cabins, yoga classes, gourmet meals, and smiling residents. The tagline read, "A community where friendship and fulfillment thrive." I frowned. It wasn't what I expected. My parents had mentioned fixing up the house and paying off debts, normal things. But this was something else entirely. A few sheets beneath the brochure was a contract, and as I skimmed the dense text, my stomach sank. The retreat wasn't just a place to visit, it was a lifestyle buy-in. The cost? A jaw-dropping $150,000. My mind raced. Had they already spent that much of the money I'd given them? And why hadn't they told me about it? I heard footsteps on the stairs and quickly placed the papers back where I found them. My mom appeared in the doorway, her face lighting up when she saw me. "There you are." I was about to make some tea. "Want some?" "Sure," I said, forcing a smile. "I'll be right down." As she headed back to the kitchen, I lingered, my thoughts swirling. It wasn't the money that bothered me, at least, not entirely. It was the secrecy, the feeling that my parents were hiding something monumental. I resolved to dig deeper. Whatever was going on, I needed to know the truth. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the small guest bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying everything I'd seen and heard. My parents had always been transparent with me, so why was this retreat kept under wraps? What was it about Silver Pines that had drawn them in so deeply? At breakfast the next morning, I decided to test the waters. "So," I began casually, "I noticed some papers in your room about Silver Pines Retreat. Looks like a fancy place." My mom froze mid-pour, the coffee pot trembling slightly in her hand. My dad's gaze flicked up from his newspaper. "Oh, that," my mom said, her tone overly light. "It's nothing, really. Just something Tom and Diane recommended." "Nothing?" "It looks like a pretty big investment," I pressed. "It's more than an investment," my dad said quietly, setting his paper down. Well, it's an opportunity." "An opportunity for what?" I asked, my tone firmer than I intended. My mom sighed, setting the coffee pot down and taking a seat at the table. "For a new way of life," she said. "Silver Pines isn't just a retreat. It's a community, a place where people can live fully, surrounded by others who share their values. It's something your father and I have been dreaming of for years." I blinked, trying to process her words. "You're thinking of moving there? Permanently?" My dad nodded, his expression calm but resolute. "We've already put down a deposit. The first phase opens in a few months." I sat back in my chair, stunned. "And you were just going to do this without telling me?" "We weren't hiding it," my mom said defensively. "We just wanted to be sure before we told you. And we didn't want you to think we were wasting the money you gave us." "Wasting it?" "Mom, I gave you that money so you could enjoy your retirement, not uproot your lives and move to some compound." "It's not a compound," my dad said firmly. "It's a community. A chance for us to connect with like-minded people, to try something different. Isn't that what you wanted for us? To be happy?" I opened my mouth to argue but stopped. Their faces, earnest and hopeful, gave me pause. This wasn't just a whim for them. It was something they believed in deeply. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. "What about Tom and Diane?" I asked. "Are they moving there too?" My mom hesitated. "Yes," she said finally. "They've already sold their house and are helping to organize the move-in process." I nodded slowly, my mind spinning. "I think I'd like to see this place for myself," I said. My dad raised an eyebrow. "Why? Don't you trust us?" "It's not about trust," I replied. "It's about understanding. If this is such a big part of your lives now, I want to know what it's all about." My parents exchanged a glance before my mom finally said, "All right. We'll take you there this weekend." The drive to Silver Pines retreat was longer than I expected. As we wound through narrow forested roads, the tension in the car was palpable. My mom chattered nervously about how much I would love the place, while my dad remained uncharacteristically quiet, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. When we finally arrived, the retreat came into view like something out of a travel magazine. A wide, gated entrance welcomed us, flanked by rows of tall pines. Beyond the gates, the sprawling compound was a mix of rustic charm and modern luxury. Log cabins dotted the landscape, connected by cobblestone pathways that wove through vibrant gardens. There was a central lodge with large glass windows overlooking a serene lake, its surface glinting in the midday sun. A cheerful woman in a navy blazer greeted us at the entrance. "Welcome to Silver Pines. You must be Mr. and Mrs. Stanton, and this must be your son." I shook her hand, introducing myself as politely as I could while my eyes took in the scene. Groups of people milled about, chatting animatedly or lounging on benches with cups of tea. It was idyllic, but something about it felt staged. We were ushered into the lodge for a tour. Inside, the walls were adorned with photos of smiling residents and motivational quotes about community and fulfillment. The guide, whose name was Diane, not the same Diane from my parents' friend group, spoke with an almost rehearsed enthusiasm. "At Silver Pines, we believe in living life to the fullest," she said, gesturing to the expansive common area. "Our residents enjoy top-tier amenities, daily activities, and the support of a close-knit community. It's not just a place to live, it's a lifestyle." As the tour continued, I noticed subtle details that began to unnerve me. Cameras were discreetly positioned in corners of the buildings, their lenses blending seamlessly with the decor. Several residents offered me bright smiles that felt a little too perfect, their friendliness teetering on the edge of artificiality. We ended the tour in a cozy lounge where we were served herbal tea. Diane handed me a booklet outlining the retreat's mission and the financial commitment required. The initial $150,000, it turned out, was just the beginning. Residents were expected to contribute monthly fees to cover maintenance, programs, and community enhancements. What happens if someone wants to leave? I asked, flipping through the booklet. Diane's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. Our residents rarely want to leave, she said smoothly. But if they do, their buy-in funds are non-refundable. It ensures everyone here is truly committed to the community. I raised an eyebrow. So, they lose their money? It's not about losing money, she replied, her voice saccharine. It's about investing in a lifestyle. After the meeting, my parents pulled me aside. They looked so hopeful, so convinced that this place was their future, that I hesitated to voice my concerns. What do you think? My mom asked, her eyes searching mine. It's impressive, I said carefully. But it's also a huge commitment. Are you sure about this? We've never been more sure of anything, my dad said firmly. Their certainty left me feeling uneasy, but I decided to hold my tongue, for now. The ride back from Silver Pines was quieter than the trip there. My parents seemed energized, chatting about their plans for the move and which cabin they hoped to get. I, on the other hand, was lost in thought. Something about the retreat didn't sit right with me. The glossy perfection of it all, the vague language about commitment and community, it felt less like a haven and more like a carefully constructed illusion. The moment Diane glossed over my question about leaving, alarm bells started ringing in my mind. Over the next few days, I couldn't let it go. I decided to dig deeper, starting with the booklet I had taken from the retreat. Hidden within the cheerful photos and testimonials were clauses that felt deliberately confusing. Terms like communal obligations and lifetime fulfillment guarantees were peppered throughout, but none were clearly defined. Then there was the financial aspect. A $150,000 buy-in followed by steep monthly fees. It wasn't just unusual, it bordered on exploitative. I couldn't imagine how people on fixed incomes, like retirees, could sustain that kind of expense. That night, I turned to the internet. A quick search of Silver Pines brought up their sleek website, complete with more idyllic photos and glowing reviews. But as I scrolled further, I stumbled upon forums and blogs where former residents, or their families, shared darker stories. One post, in particular, caught my attention. It was written by the son of a couple who had moved to Silver Pines. His parents had drained their life savings to join, only to find that the retreat's promises of fulfillment came with strings attached. Residents were pressured into participating in constant activities, their personal lives closely monitored. And if they expressed dissatisfaction or wanted to leave, they were ostracized by the community. Another thread described how some residents had fallen into financial ruin trying to keep up with the monthly fees. Those who couldn't pay were subtly pushed out, left with nothing to show for their investment. I read until the early hours of the morning, each new story adding to my growing unease. By the time I closed my laptop, I was certain of one thing: I needed to confront my parents. The next day, I drove back to their house, my chest tight with a mix of anger and worry. When I arrived, I found them in the living room, poring over floor plans of the cabins. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice more serious than I intended. My mom looked up, startled. "Of course. What's wrong?" I hesitated, then plunged in. "I've been reading about Silver Pines. Some of the stories aren't exactly glowing." "What stories?" my dad asked, his tone defensive. "Accounts from people who've lived there, or tried to leave. They talk about how controlling the place is, how expensive it becomes. It's not as perfect as they make it sound. My parents exchanged a glance, their expressions shifting from surprise to something closer to irritation. Those are just disgruntled people, my mom said dismissively. Every place has its critics. Maybe, I said, but don't you think it's worth looking into before you commit your entire future? We've already looked into it, my dad said firmly. Tom and Diane have been there multiple times. They love it, and so do we. You're overthinking this. I wanted to argue, but their resolve was unwavering. Just promise me you'll be careful, I said finally. My mom softened, reaching for my hand. We appreciate your concern, but we've made up our minds. This is what we want. As I left their house, my frustration gave way to a sinking feeling of helplessness. They were adults, free to make their own decisions, even if those decisions were mistakes. But as I got into my car, a thought struck me: if they wouldn't listen to warnings, maybe I needed to gather proof. Something tangible that would make them see the risks they were taking. I started the engine, my mind already forming a plan. I returned to Silver Pines a few days later, this time without my parents. I didn't tell them I was going, figuring it was better to investigate on my own. If I found nothing, no harm done, but if there was more to uncover, I didn't want them feeling blindsided. The drive was familiar now, the winding roads through dense forest no longer as enchanting as they were unsettling. When I arrived at the retreat, I parked just outside the main gates, observing from a distance. The same idyllic scene played out before me, residents laughing, chatting, and walking hand in hand along the cobblestone paths. I walked up to the reception desk under the pretense of learning more about the community. A receptionist greeted me with a wide smile, her demeanor as polished as the floors beneath her. "Are you considering joining our family here at Silver Pines?" she asked. "Possibly," I said, mirroring her warmth. "I just have a few questions about how everything works." She handed me another glossy brochure and launched into the same spiel I'd heard on my first visit. I nodded along, letting her talk while I mentally catalogued details. Then I pivoted to the questions I really wanted answers to. How does Silver Pines handle finances for long-term residents? I asked. Her smile tightened slightly. We work closely with our residents to ensure they can continue enjoying the lifestyle we provide. And if someone wants to leave? She hesitated. We do everything we can to support our residents in their decision to join this community, and very few ever choose to leave. Not exactly an answer. I thanked her and walked around the grounds, trying to blend in with the residents. They were friendly, but there was a strange uniformity to their conversations. Everyone spoke about the same things: their gratitude for the community, their participation in group activities, their shared sense of purpose. It felt rehearsed, almost scripted. As I wandered, I spotted a man sitting alone on a bench near the lake. His posture was slumped, his gaze distant. Something about him stood out from the polished smiles surrounding him. I approached cautiously. "Mind if I sit?" He glanced at me, then shrugged. "Suit yourself." We sat in silence for a moment before I spoke. "You don't look as enthusiastic as everyone else." He let out a bitter laugh. "That's one way to put it. What's wrong?" He hesitated, then leaned closer. "Look, I don't know who you are, but if you're thinking about joining this place, don't. It's not what they tell you." My heart quickened. "What do you mean?" "It's all smoke and mirrors," he said, his voice low. "They lure you in with promises of community and happiness, but once you're here, it's different. They control everything: your time, your money, even who you talk to. And if you try to leave..." He trailed off, his expression dark. "What happens if you try to leave?" I pressed. "They make it impossible," he said grimly. "You're tied up financially, and the community turns against you. I've seen people lose everything: retirement savings, their homes. It's like a trap you can't escape. Why are you still here?" Because I don't have a choice, he said bitterly. I sank everything I had into this place, and now I'm stuck. And so are a lot of others. His words sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't just a case of buyer's remorse, it was something far more sinister. As I left the retreat that day, my resolve hardened. I had the proof I needed. Now I just had to figure out how to make my parents see it before it was too late. When I got back to my apartment, I spent hours compiling everything I'd learned about Silver Pines. I printed the accounts from former residents, annotated the fine print in the brochures, and transcribed my conversation with the man by the lake. By the time I was done, I had a small mountain of evidence. The next morning, I called my parents and asked if I could come over. My mom sounded cheerful as ever, oblivious to the storm brewing on my end. Of course, dear. We're always happy to see you. When I arrived, I noticed more signs of their commitment to Silver Pines. Boxes were stacked in the hallway, labeled with "Donate" and "Keep." It hit me that they were already preparing to leave. We sat down in the living room, and I pulled out the folder of evidence. I need to talk to you about Silver Pines, I began. My dad groaned. Not this again. Just hear me out, I said, my tone firmer than before. Please. Reluctantly, they agreed, and I began walking them through what I'd found. I started with the financial structure, the hefty buy-in and the unrelenting monthly fees. Then I explained the restrictions on leaving, how the retreat kept residents financially and emotionally tethered. Here are testimonials from people who live there, I said, sliding the printed pages across the coffee table. They thought it would be paradise, but it turned out to be a nightmare. My mom picked up a page, her face pale as she skimmed the words. This can't be right, she murmured. Tom and Diane never said anything like this. Maybe they didn't know, I said. Or maybe they're too deep in to admit it. But it's happening, and it's exactly what you're about to walk into. My dad leaned back, crossing his arms. This all sounds like exaggeration. People always blame someone else when things don't work out for them. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Dad, I went back there. I talked to a man who's stuck because he can't afford to leave. He told me the same things I'm showing you now. It's not just online gossip, it's real. My mom looked at my dad, her eyes filled with doubt. What if he's right? What if we're making a mistake? My dad hesitated, his resolve visibly cracking. But we've already put down the deposit. We'd lose so much money if we backed out now. I nodded, acknowledging the dilemma. I get that, but losing the deposit is better than sinking your entire future into something that's going to bleed you dry. You're lucky you haven't sold the house yet. You can still walk away. They were silent for a long time. My mom fidgeted with the hem of her sweater, while my dad stared at the folder, his expression unreadable. Finally, my mom spoke. Maybe we should take a step back, she said softly. At least look into this more before we make a final decision. My dad sighed heavily but nodded. All right. We'll hold off for now. Relief washed over me, but I knew it wasn't over. They were still drawn to the dream Silver Pines had sold them. I needed to make sure they didn't fall back into the trap. In the following weeks, I stayed close, visiting often and helping them rediscover the joys of their current life. We worked on small home improvement projects, spent time with neighbors, and even started planning a family vacation. Slowly, the allure of Silver Pines seemed to fade. A month later, my parents called me to share their final decision. They had pulled out of the retreat, forfeiting their deposit but saving themselves from a much greater loss. We realized we don't need a place like that to be happy, my mom said. We already have everything we need right here. Hearing those words was a greater gift than the money I had given them. They had come close to losing themselves in the promise of something better, but in the end, they chose to hold on to the life they'd built, a life that was already full. As I hung up the phone, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't just about the money. It was about protecting the people I loved from something that could have destroyed them. And in the end, we were all better for it.